Good evening, friends. Welcome to the India Power Talk. India Power Talk is a knowledge sharing initiative. We invite international thought leaders and domain experts to share their insights, experiences, and strategies related to business and economy. The result is an easily accessible digital source of knowledge that benefits not only Indian entrepreneurs and policymakers, but also international businesses, investors, and strategic partners who have invested in or intend to invest in India. Our speakers include entrepreneurs, economists, professors, investment bankers, inventors, scientists, lawyers, chartered accountants, and other senior professionals with experience in diverse sectors. Today's topic is future of public transportation in cities. Driverless cars steering through city streets, commercial drones airlifting packages, computer captained ships navigating the high seas. Revolutionary changes in technology are ushering in a bold and unparalleled age in transportation. These technologies promise improvements in mobility, safety, efficiency, and convenience. Will the technological revolution reduce congestion, fuel use, and pollution? Or will it make the situation worse by encouraging more personal trips and more frequent freight shipments? In any case, the challenges are undeniable. Growing populations, the proliferation of cheap and efficient vehicles, and urban sprawl make efficient transportation increasingly difficult in major cities. Today's top three transport challenges are congestion, stretch, and cost, are complex, requiring responses that are both strategic and creative. And to talk about this complex and interesting subject, we welcome Mihir Benison from London. Mihir works for the global engineering and advisory firm Arup. He has a background in architecture, engineering, and project management, and an interest in transport, the value of public spaces, and their role in driving regeneration. Mihir has vast experience in managing complex strategic policy, infrastructure, and built environment projects at a variety of scales and stages. He has recently been involved in the development of Euston High Speed 2 station and the road ushering pricing strategy to support the expansion of prestigious Heathrow Airport. Prior to joining Arup, he spent 4 years with Network Rail, the UK's national rail infrastructure owner, where he was project manager for the Waterloo Station Upgrade and a business case exploring better management modules for stations. Mihir additionally holds positions on panels with Greater London Authority and Harrow Council, where he is helping to shape future infrastructure and regeneration within London. Mihir, good morning to you and welcome to India Power Talk. And thank you for your valuable time and engagement. To begin with, could you tell us about your work and expertise as senior transport and city planner in the UK?
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on your program. I think it's really great. And as a non-resident Indian, I think being able to share some knowledge, hopefully knowledge that I have, I think is a really good opportunity for me. I suppose to answer your question, I wanted to start with where my interest lies, and it's really in the intersection between how transport can create and shape places within cities. Transport can impact densities, land values, but also the healthiness of communities. And I really love the complexity that those sorts of projects bring. I feel, well, you've covered sort of the variety that I've had in my career so far. And I think it's really provided me with a breadth of experience, which means I can really act as an integrator at upstream planning projects, so projects at a very early stage in their process, where quite a lot of decisions need to be made, which influence things downstream. You've already mentioned some of the organizations I've worked for. So I've worked on the client side for organizations like Network Rail and Heathrow Airport Limited, but also within consultancy, as I'm doing now with Arup, but also previously for some architecture firms. And so I have an understanding of how complex client organizations function, but also how work is procured and delivered. And I try to complement this with my work on the panels that you mentioned with the GLA and Harrow. So it's really sort of trying to understand how people make decisions, how they form their policies. And what this requires is an appreciation of multiple disciplines. So in my current role, I'm really able to bring together some of the best architects, urban designers, economists, town planners, environmental specialists, and transport consultants as well, to help shape these projects at a really early stage.
Mihir, let me straight away bring you to India. India is a vast nation, both geographically and by population. Now, instead of asking your view on the current state of affairs in Indian transport system and bothering you with that, let me ask you what Indian cities can learn from UK and the rest of the world when it comes to transport and city planning.
I think the biggest lesson India can learn um, is really to think about growing cities in a human-centered way, and really thinking about what streets should be for. And they really need to be for people. They need to be designed for people. And this is really important as we think about the recovery from COVID and the shift towards
Absolutely.
zero net carbon. And the thing I wanted to explain to you is really the way I like to think about the hierarchy of transport modes. So if we think about an inverted triangle where the flat part is at the top and the point at the bottom, what we want to do is we want to have the cycling and the walking at the top.
I
And
see.
we want to promote this as the low carbon and healthy way of getting around our cities, particularly for shorter journeys. And then as we move into the middle of that triangle, um, there we should have trains, buses, and other mass transit, which are good for slightly longer distances, or where you might not wish to walk, or you can't walk or cycle. And then at the bottom of that triangle, at the point, we want to have the taxis and the private cars, which are really the least efficient modes and should be reserved for journeys which can't be completed conveniently in the other two ways that I've just described. But I think it's taken us a long time to learn those lessons of the damage that these big roads, channeling through our cities can cause, and the impacts to health and well-being as well in the longer term. And they really influenced the ways our cities are structured. And you mentioned some of this in your introduction, really thinking about uh, how our cities are structured for us to consume more carbon, in a sense, that making us commute from further afield, having sprawling suburbs, with big gardens, big driveways, and they essentially discourage us from walking. And so it's clear to me that these decisions that we made many years ago, we're still trying to take care of now. I think we also need to think about how we value pedestrians.
Mhm.
There's a recent report that was published by the Living Streets Foundation in the UK called the Pedestrian Pound, and it
Mhm.
cites quite a few examples where actually investment in improving public realm, pedestrianization of streets, giving more street space to people has resulted in much greater levels of footfall in our town centres, and more spending, people spending more time as well in those locations, and strengthening local businesses, ultimately leading to more jobs and stronger economies and more resilient neighborhoods, which is really what we're trying to create, especially um, coming out of this difficult time. um, there are some other good examples as well. In London, Transport for London developed the Healthy Streets Indicators, which establishes this wheel of 10 indicators against which you assess the quality of the proposed urban environment
Wow.
and the area that you live in. And I don't think it's necessarily it shouldn't be used purely for the London context. I think it's applicable everywhere, but
Absolutely.
it's an interesting way of making decisions, really, because we're now being encouraged to use this tool in developing our projects.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
This is really fantastic thoughts about how to develop the pedestrian pound, and I'm really glad that you mentioned this. It is what you're saying is absolutely right, Mihir. Or let me now, Mihir, ask you your view on rising car ownerships, particularly. Do you think so? The increase of the multiple models of cars and the ownership as such would impact Indian cities?
Yeah, I think India is as you mentioned, is a vast nation. It's got a huge population. I mean, car ownership levels in India compared to the UK and to the US are quite low. And you know, that's probably a function of affordability levels. But we must sort of remember that. But you know, as the wealth in India rises, there could be a considerable impact in India. I mean, at the moment we have in India 41 vehicles for every 1,000 inhabitants compared to 471 in the UK and 838 in the US. So you can see the scale of or the magnitude of the difference there. But you know, if we start approaching similar levels of ownership as the UK and the US in India, the impact could be absolutely massive, right?
Absolutely correct.
And then the infrastructure that would be required to cope with that, just thinking about the roads, but also parking and fuel stations and all the distribution of that. It's vast, isn't it?
Yes. But then the question, Mihir, is how do we tackle the congestion on the roads? On one
So
hand, what you're saying is right. You know, we can't really compare ourselves, and we can't really be in that race of buying cars. But then, how do we really cope and tackle the congestion?
so there are a number of different ways we can do this. And you know, cars are seen as being so convenient at the moment, and the reason for that is because in most cases they are free at the point of use, and by that really I mean once you've bought a car, you've paid the insurance on it, it's sitting in your parking lot with a
Yes,
full tank of fuel, you don't have to pay a penny to use it. And so we need to look at the kind of push and pull mechanisms of how we change behavior. So in terms of the push mechanisms, we need to think about how we make the car less attractive. So what do we have available? We have things like taxation, restricting or banning vehicles, increasing the cost of motoring in other ways, and just making it less convenient overall. But then
in
we also,
Delhi,
oh, go
in
ahead.
Delhi, here in Delhi, recently we experimented by having odd and even numbers of cars plying on the roads.
Yes, yes, I did recall that reading that on in various articles and things, and I thought that was a really interesting way of doing it, and I think it's something that probably India could implement in quite a quick way, and I don't think it's something we could do in Europe or the UK in quite the same way. I suppose a comparable approach that we've got is in London. We have a daily congestion charge that is applied, so it's £15 per day. There's also been a separate vehicle emissions charge introduced for more polluting vehicles, and there are other cities that are introducing this sort of charging. But what that's done is in a 10-year period since it was introduced, it's resulted in a 10% reduction in traffic volumes between 2003 and 2013. But the problem is in London, because we've reduced the physical space available to cars, the congestion has actually remained the same. But you know, there are real issues with introducing these sorts of charging regimes, and you know, it's hard to determine what that level of the charge needs to be, who it should apply to, when it's applicable, and how it's enforced. And really the key is to set it at a level and in a way that nudges that behavior, but isn't unduly unfair to those who must drive or don't have an alternative to drive. And so the planning required for something like that, from my experience, is, you know, you need to conduct quite a lot of surveys, consultation, and then you need to undertake a lot of modeling to see what that impact is and what the shift to public transport or other modes will be. But yeah, that the Delhi example is a really interesting one actually, and I think that was off the back of the Delhi smogs, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So I suppose in India, really what we need to try and do is to encourage the use of cars for the right purpose. And this is really where there are gaps in public transportation. And I know in a lot of cities where metros are being built, that they're already at capacity from day one because they've been needed for a long time.
Yes,
And as soon
absolutely.
as they're built, they're absolutely packed. But really, this is the way that we need to think. And I'm trying to think about some other schemes that we have in the UK and in Europe. For instance, park and ride schemes. I don't know if you'd have heard of these types of things, and they might exist in India as well.
Mhm. Yes.
But you have, large car parks on the fringes of the of a settlement, and you have stations or mass rapid transit hubs at that point. And the last mile is really then not by car, it's by these high capacity vehicles. But then again, you also have to weigh up the convenience factor here and how much people would be prepared to pay for that sort of service. Cars spend 95% of their time sitting in a car parking space. So how can we use the ones that do exist much more efficiently?
Mhm. No, you're absolutely right. But this really will take a lot of efforts on the part of the developers. Also, I guess tough political resolve will need to
Mm.
create regulations and rules and policies so that the development is not just one single unit development, but it is is a complete development of a city, keeping in mind the requirements and keeping in mind the future growth. uh, but having said this, Mihir, it will be very interesting for us to know from you. Then, given the situation that, look, we are already late in creating public transportation. We do not have too much of resources as the Western world has. And given the need urgency of the public transportation, how can we create and deliver attractive and safe public transportation and an active travel networks, as quickly as possible, efficiently, and in less resources? What would be your inputs on that?
So one example I wanted to cite of the impact of rising car ownership is sort of taking Mumbai as an example, and it kind of hints at how congestion can make cities no longer function properly. So yeah, if we look at Mumbai, commuters from northern residential areas such as Borivali traveling to the city's central business district, such as Lower Parel, are faced with losses of up to 350 rupees every day per person. And that congestion is cost is split 100 rupees in lost wages and then 250 on fuel every day. And these costs really hurt the city's productivity. And there are also other implications where the residents in North Mumbai may not seek employment, for instance, in South Mumbai, even if it matches their skill set. So you're kind of limiting that
Yeah,
pool of potential talent. And this is going to create um, poor access to suitable candidates if employers are based in the South. But but then the sprawl that we also mentioned, that is also going to become the case as businesses maybe choose to locate in areas which are more accessible,
absolutely.
away from congestion. So I think we probably need to sort of go back to the basics, sort of what is going to create an attractive transport network, and think about some of the basic needs. So it needs to be safe, clean, and convenient. I think those are really the basics.
Yeah,
So if we can get India's buses, I think buses are going to be the easiest way of doing that because the
yes,
road networks already exist. And I guess that's sort of happening gradually. Um, cities are investing in newer fleets with cleaner engines and running on LPG, for instance, and some of them I've seen recently are low floor buses, which means they're much more accessible
yes,
for those, particularly the elderly and people with disabilities.
yes.
So I think in the first instance, that's probably the quickest way of introducing a public transport service. I think where we have probably a lower need for that level of service, I think Uber and Ola and those sorts of companies are filling the gap really, and they're providing that option. I think what we need to try and avoid is using those sorts of models for point-to-point journeys, and we probably need to think about them for using them for only the portion of the journey where it's not possible to use public transport. But I think ultimately India is going to have to develop some longer term plans for its cities because of the length of time it takes to deliver these sorts of projects. And we really need to think about embedding that good design and architecture right from the start, because some of the decisions taken at the early stages, and if you don't allow the active provision and the space for railway lines or bus routes or cycle routes, they're very difficult to then weave into
Yes,
the urban structure, aren't they?
absolutely.
And I think also going back to that design point, I think a lot of Indian cities are trying to build the metro lines as quickly as possible, and I can completely see why building, at street level or the elevated metros are the way forwards in those instances. But in the longer term and the medium term as well, I think they can have kind of negative impacts on the city itself. In some cases, they can affect land values. They create kind of visual divisions between neighborhoods, and also, I mean, one example from my last visit to Delhi was that you don't sort of see it right away, but that in some instances where the elevated metro has been built above a very busy street with tall buildings either side,
Yeah,
you experience quite high levels of fumes and emissions below that metro deck when you're walking up to the station, perhaps. And I think that sort of modeling and planning needs to be more rigorous at the start to make sure you don't end up with situations like that. I suppose that I wanted to also point at the importance of stations and the role they play. And stations is something I'm quite passionate about. Uh, a lot of projects that I've worked on have been related to railway stations, and I wanted to point to a document Arup recently published in collaboration with Network Rail called Tomorrow's Living Station, and it essentially defines 3 principles for planning a succession in the future. And those 3 principles are seeing stations as a center of movement for people. So really thinking about how they can be efficient places of movement, how they need to be located, how the entrances need to be distributed, thinking about the interchange between different modes, and how you avoid that penalty that happens when you change between modes. The second principle is them acting as a driver for inclusive and sustainable growth. Stations have been linked to economic activity. They are a generator and a
yes,
creator of foot flow, movement of people, and so what that enables is businesses to locate close by. It allows you to build at higher densities, and as a result, land values are higher. I mean, that's not always historically been the case, because railways used to be filthy, dirty things with steam and coal, but now that they've become a lot cleaner with electric power, businesses and housing, you want that to be located close to the railway line. And then the third principle, which maybe sometimes gets forgotten about, is ensuring that stations are at the heart of healthy communities. And this is really about what stations enable for people, and they enable access for employment, access to amenities, access to friends and family. And then you start to think about what other facilities might you provide in the vicinity of a station? And this is how you then start to build a settlement and a really successful place. And a really good example of this has been King's Cross in London, where there's been a whole new quarter centered around the redevelopment of two stations, King's Cross and St Pancras, and transforming redundant railway land has regenerated what was essentially a very deprived area into a hub for employment. Google are looking to move their offices there. It's a great place to go for a meal in the evening, and it's a very attractive place to live now. But we need to see transport and city making it hand in hand. I don't think it anymore we can see transport for the sake of transport, if you see what what I mean.
Mihir, from developers, from policymakers, from resources, from geography, from old habitants, communities, and experience, let's move towards one big element which is really, really playing a big role, and that's technology. And I would really like you to dwell upon how technology is changing the world of transport. Because in the introduction, I mentioned about the drones and lot of fanciful instruments which are really fast forwarding the entire concept of transport. Could you dwell upon that?
Yes, I suppose it'd be good to maybe start by reflecting on some of the innovations that have happened recently and might happen in the near future, and then I think speculate on some of the changes that and enhancements that the likes of drones will bring. I think we've already seen the impact technology can have on the way we move around. I mean, look at Google Maps, for instance,
Absolutely.
and the information we have available on our phone now, the live information, including, timetable data for trains, tells us how congested our roads are and how busy individual carriages on a train might be. But I think one of the great recent shifts, particularly in Europe and citing London particularly, has been the shift towards smart and digital ticketing. TfL have been pioneers in this by creating the Oyster card in 2003, which is a contactless payment card. And what they did maybe differently to others was they made it so you could use it across buses, tubes, then brought rail into that as well. You can use it on the river boats, and now you can even use it on a cable car across London. But I think it's essentially transformed travel across London. And the technology has now evolved to include contactless bank cards, and it's rendered paper tickets pretty much obsolete. So, I can leave my home and I don't even need to think about how I'm going to get to my friend's house across the city. I just, plan this out using an app and, tap, 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 and I've made my way through, and I check my account and it's deducted quite a bit of money. But I think that has made moving around using public transportation super easy, and I think that's great. We already talked about shared mobility options such as car clubs, but bike rental is also becoming quite big across our cities, and micro mobility as well. So the e-scooters, which the UK actually banned, and now they're starting to trial again in a more regulated way.
No, even
But
India, even in India, in some of the cities, we are thinking of starting these scooter cabs.
Oh, the scooter cabs. Oh, I see. I was talking more about the electric scooters that you stand on, and so are you talking about someone who drives you around on a scooter?
Yes.
Ah, right. Okay. That's an interesting one, actually. I suppose if we think about Uber's traffic, quite a lot of times you've probably only got one person in the back of the car, and it takes up so much space. So actually, a scooter is probably quite an efficient way of taking someone around India,
It's
particularly
already
if
there.
you're on
I think it's there in
congested
Bangkok
roads.
and other Southeast countries.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I think Uber and sort of those sorts of models, I think, are interesting, but but we need to look at the sort of negative sides of them as well.
Sure.
Because one statistic I read about was in San Francisco, congestion actually increased by 62% between 2010 and 2016 as the ride sharing platforms became more mainstream. And so, whilst I think they offer a really great convenience, I think the whole point about congestion isn't addressed by them, which is interesting. I think a response to that has been looking at the trial of demand responsive bus services, which is for me quite fascinating. And TfL, Transport for London, are currently trialing a couple of these. I know they've been trialed in California as well, but they effectively take multiple passengers heading in vaguely the same direction and book them onto a shared vehicle. And services, rather than operating a set route, they operate from a corner to a corner, and there's no fixed route. So an algorithm basically works out the most efficient route to pick up and drop off those people. And the app shows people where a virtual bus stop is. And it might not be, specifically at their end destination or their start destination. It will be perhaps 200 meters away. And that helps the whole system remain vaguely efficient. But I think that's an interesting development of that Uber model. But I think we're still waiting to see a structure that works for that. But ultimately, what we're trying to create, I think, with technology and the digital platform is this mobility as a service, where we no longer see transport as something we need to own parts of, and this mobility as a service concept is essentially a digital platform that allows us to plan, book, and use end-to-end journeys using different modes, effectively creating a really good experience for the person, but overcoming the fragmentation that exists within our journey. I suppose another area which we've kind of touched on, but it's sort of thinking about EVs, electric vehicles, and hydrogen vehicles,
Absolutely.
which are very much starting to become more and more mainstream.
EV is becoming the buzz of the next decade, I guess.
Definitely, and we think about some of the policies and which governments are starting to announce across the world. For example, the government here announced in November that they were going to bring forward the date that they were going to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2040 to 2030. So the change is going to happen even quicker. But we should think about what impact that will have in terms of taxation and tax revenue in particular, because a lot of the UK's tax revenue does come from petrol and diesel tax. And if that tax base is going to reduce because we're going to start plugging our cars in and we're going to use hydrogen, where will that money come from to fund infrastructure enhancements? So a lot of countries at the moment are exploring whether they could implement road user pricing. And so thinking about a pence per mile or a rupee per mile type pricing model for roads and streets. And that also creates another opportunity to regulate demand as well. So you might not apply the same pricing model, say, in a rural area or a little used road to a city during peak times. So, a rural road might cost 10 times less to use than a city road at peak hours, because you want to discourage that sort of behavior, and there might be alternatives available. And this is going to require quite a lot of technology to set up, a lot of automation. It's going to require GPS potentially, and vehicles to be smart and be able to communicate with GPS and cameras in a certain way. So I think that is something that is going to become more and more prevalent across the world. You mentioned, I think let's sort of shift into being a bit more visionary and imagine a bit more. So starting with automation, there have been quite a few trials of automated vehicles, and there are various levels of automation that even our current vehicles have, like, radar guided cruise control, which monitor the distance between you and the car in front, and optimize the braking and the acceleration. But there are some real challenges of going towards full automation, especially in a world where we have this kind of hybrid of normal cars and automated cars, and then people crossing the road, and trying to create automation in that world where you have that uncertainty of human behavior and human reaction is proving to be actually quite tricky. And there are a number of questions around insurance and who holds the I suppose the responsibility if something goes wrong. And we've already seen a few examples of things going wrong
Yes.
where people haven't been paying attention on motorways in the US, and they've hit things. So I think that's a technology that I think will come, but it's still going to require time to come to full maturity. I think areas where it could work are where there is separation from people, perhaps. So maybe it will work better on motorways, and maybe within goods yards and ports and things like that, where you have a much more controlled space. The other things you mentioned were, what was it? Flying cars and drones.
I was about to ask that from from electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles.
Yeah.
In the recent report by the World Economic Forum, they spoke about flying cars.
Yes.
And this idea is not new, and also but I guess it will face every country will have its own regulatory issues. But my question to you is, are we approaching a breakthrough in terms of technology, because by virtue of the flying cars? And what would be as a planner, what would be your thoughts on the flying cars or the roadworthy aircrafts?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one, sort of flying vehicles is something that I get challenged on quite a lot in some of our design work. I think it depends where we see their role. I think if I go back to that mobility as a service point, I think it needs to be less about thinking about ownership of these types of vehicles and where they fit in and where that gap is that they could fill. So perhaps flying cars would be good for areas where there isn't sufficient public transport provision, where there isn't public transport provision and there is limited road provision.
Yes.
So maybe where there are relatively few highways and you want to get from A to B quite quickly. So I don't think that there'd be something that I would encourage within cities, but perhaps in more rural areas, or where you have island nations with lots of islands, I think that could be a very interesting proposition where the terrain makes it a requirement. I think in terms of, if you think about drones, I think that's a slightly separate separate
Drones
one.
is a separate issue altogether. You're right.
Yeah, and I think if we think about how some of our cities have evolved, being tall, lots of skyscrapers, particular cities in China, think about Dubai, US, you have to get from your apartment, which might be on the 50th, 60th floor, to the street level. It might take, less time to actually go to the top of the building. So do we need to think of a network actually that exists at ground level, which is already quite developed in a lot of cases, and a network that exists at the tops of the buildings, if you like, and allows maybe deliveries to happen at the tops of buildings because it's more efficient. Maybe the streets are congested, and actually Amazon can deliver parcels much more easily to
Mhm.
the tops of buildings. But I suppose you could also see it as a way of transporting people around from tops of buildings to tops of buildings. So I don't think that is necessarily such a bad idea, because if you are in a city where you have lots of tall buildings, there is an advantage in that way.
Yes.
I don't think it would work in somewhere like London, where we have, relatively low building heights, and probably quite a few Indian cities as well, actually, where the building heights aren't there. But the thing is, you do have a lot of congestion. So
Yeah.
perhaps, you get your Uber Eats, McDonald's delivery via drone. That could work quite well. Maybe I'm convinced.
Great. Thank you, Amir, for that. We can't conclude the discussion without talking about COVID and the impact that we are going to have. So, what do you think, Mihir, would be the long-term impacts of COVID particularly on the long term on the transport network, because we have to maintain social distancing, and this will become a norm, I guess, for at least for
Mm.
some time.
So I think I'll start by just saying, like, I think COVID's created basically a shock to our cities, a shock to our transport infrastructure system, and because of the long lead times for infrastructure projects, the only way our infrastructure has been able to respond is operationally. So, timetables have been changed, or longer trains or shorter trains have been provided, and we look in the UK, and train operators are reducing services by 50 to 60% in the current lockdown, which is the response. But in the longer term, there are likely to be some permanent changes to our behavior. I mean, in many cases, offices are shut now. We're working from home, and so how much of that is going to result in us, permanently changing the way we live and work and move around? Um, I mean, interesting, in the short term, we've seen increases in demand for private vehicles in the UK, and actually used car values in a lot of cases have gone up.
Same in
Um,
India.
and yeah, I can imagine this is true across the world. But will this continue? Um, there are some statistics that show, a lot of employers are carrying out employee surveys at the moment to understand how people will work in the future, and I
Mm.
think it's very dependent on the organization and the type of work people do. But it's predicted between 30 and 70% of staff will either work remotely or in a hybridized way,
Yeah.
part of the time in the office, part of the time at home. And what that's going to do is it's really going to change that demand profile for how we use public transport, how we use roads, how we occupy our cities. And and what is tending to happen is people are starting to think about moving away from city center locations into suburbs, areas with gardens, more green spaces. But also, if they're not having to commute every day, they're actually choosing to even move to a different city.
Yes.
And so the sort of models and demand models that we were using to plan our infrastructure are now completely out of the water. We don't know for sure, whether we need to build that new railway line or widen that road. And so it's really causing some challenges there. And as you mentioned, we may need to procure different types of rolling stock on the railway, or new types of buses which allow you to flex how people occupy those vehicles, because as the transmission number changes, you might need to introduce social distancing at short notice, but the current rolling stock and current vehicles maybe don't allow that. And I think one particular area where we probably need to have more integration is actually between how we invest in digital infrastructure,
Yes.
because in some respects, the Zoom call as we're on now has actually replaced the need to travel.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so how do we sort of put pitch the investment in fiber optic cables against a new motorway, for instance? And I think that needs to become far more integrated.
So Mir, thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure talking to you. With a lot of insights, lot of experience, and lot of thinking on transportation. I am sure it's a more than a complex topic than what we discussed. I'm sure it will add a lot of value to our audience. I would like to thank the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, the Indian Chamber of Commerce, LawSICO, and the India SME Accelerator Network. Let me conclude with an humble prayer to the Almighty to bestow mankind the right spirit to fight the coronavirus and help restore peace, prosperity, and well-being. Thank you, Mihir. It is pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome, Nitin. Thank you.